It's always interesting to see what's on folks' minds, and I have some questions that people sent in ahead that I'm going to walk through first, and then I'll be glad to do my best on more until we run out of time for our sermon time this morning. I'm going to look at my watch more than I usually do. Questioning and exploring our personal and collective truths is foundational to Unitarian Universalism, and I always have a good time preparing for this service. I will say I didn't get any questions like I did from Graham, I think the last time must have been in 2019 before COVID, about whether vampires are Unitarian. He didn't think I'd take it seriously, but I did. The answer is yes. So, the first question I got was, is Unitarian Universalism considered to be Christian? I'm going to give a short answer and the longer answer. The short answer is no, we're not part of the World Council of Churches. Our Unitarian and Universalist roots were absolutely Christian, but in their beginnings, they were heresies. The Unitarians, not being Trinitarians, separated from the Congregationalists in the United States back in the 1800s. The Universalists were Trinitarian and remained explicitly Christian for longer, though still holding the heresy of universal salvation. By the time of consolidation, when the denominations joined together in 1963, Unitarian Universalism was not considered a Christian tradition because it did not hold following Jesus as the only way to salvation and was not Trinitarian. Now, that said, there are plenty of Christian Unitarian Universalists all over, including a number in our congregation. And I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I believe that most are here rather than, say, down the street at a United Church of Christ congregation because, well, they have an affinity for understanding theology through a Christian lens. They don't want that to be the only lens. And it's wonderful when folks bring with them the metaphors and symbols that help them make meaning as we help each other figure out how to describe our beliefs, experience, and connection with all that is, whatever we call that for ourselves. Connected to this, someone else asked what my personal definition of God is. These days, the language that I'm most drawn to is the transcendent, or in all caps, that which we can never fully know. But that's kind of a mouthful. I personally don't believe in an anthropomorphic God, though I know for some that's a helpful image, especially in prayer. But I do believe in a force outside of our understanding that connects everything. Another way to say that is I believe the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There's a fancy theological term for this called panentheism, which also connects with process theology, which we've talked about some in the past. But in case that's not something that's readily available in your memories, as a reminder, process thought is a philosophy that was first developed by Alfred North Whitehead in the 1920s. His work has been interpreted widely over the years, in part because his work is so hard to read that nobody actually reads it except scholars who then write books about it, and then we read those books. And out of that philosophy, a school of theology developed. This theology is also technically a Christian heresy, but hey, so are we, so we have a lot in common. John Cobb is one of the founders of process theology, and he explains that in this model, God is radically relational. God is part of all things and not only impacts the world, but is impacted by the world. When we suffer, God suffers with us. In process theology, there's a force acting in every moment to lure us to greater connection and actions that are good for the whole of creation. We, of course, have the free will to ignore this whisper in our ear, which some might describe as our conscience. The reason this began as a heresy is it denies the all-powerful nature of God, which is part of Christian orthodoxy. Process theology and our seventh principle also importantly frame human beings as part of creation, of all that is, rather than the pinnacle of a mountain above everything else. Process theology, like Unitarian Universalism, started in Christianity and took some turns in similar directions, so we can find resonance. And there are plenty of Christians who would also describe their theology with the language of process theology. It has remained closer to the fold, though, as a school of thought on the edges of Christianity, rather than splitting off to form a church on its own. But there are also lots of UUs engaged in writing and thinking about this area as well. So, fun. And this leads me in part to the last question that was submitted ahead, which asked about why I do ministry, and in particular, part-time ministry. When I went to seminary, I thought I was headed to what we call community ministry. I thought I would be doing something more like social work or justice work, but with a Unitarian Universalist lens. But when I got to seminary, I realized that I really love parish ministry. I love getting to do so many different kinds of things in one job. As part of the process for getting ordained, you have to go to this career counseling thing. It's like a 3-day psychological evaluation and career assessment. You take lots of those little tests and you sit in a room and talk to people and look at ink blots and do the whole thing. Okay, so in the career assessment, there was, I don't even remember how many questions, but, pages and pages of questions that asked you about, like, would you be interested in working with your hands, being outside, being in a garden, doing whatever, like being in a room, typing on a computer. Like, it listed every kind of permutation that you could think of. And for most of them, I was like, sure. I wanted a variety of things. And so I think it didn't sort of point me in one direction or another, but I remember the career counselor was like, it'll be fine. Okay. Anyway, so some of the things I get to do in this kind of ministry is work with people to accomplish things. And do that well, we try and make a more loving and just world. I like talking theology. Like, I took that one little question and decided, you probably wanted a sermon on process theology. Maybe you didn't. But I like talking about that kind of stuff. And at the same time, building better administrative systems, building worship that tries to connect folks in lots of different ways, writing and teaching classes, visiting with folks, all sorts of things. Ministry is a Jack and Jane of all trades kind of thing. Remote places to live have always been my ideal, hence my home on a hill. And that usually means part-time ministry, simply based on population. And all that said, landing in the Berkshires has been fun, and there are lots more folks around here than where I live. I've managed to build a second parallel career for myself in higher education, which has made all of this work. One of the challenges of any job, I suppose, but I feel it particularly in part-time bivocational ministry, is that I can't do as much as I would like to, given the time I have. There are some projects and ideas that I push off to a future time, which would probably also, I'm sure, be true in full-time ministry, but it can be a bummer. There are a lot of things that I might do differently if I had more time. And I really try and hold myself to be in the ballpark of my intended hours. All that said, we have an incredible lay leadership team in this congregation. There are things that lay folks do for this community that in a larger congregation would be carried by the minister or other staff. And we are lucky that it has been working so well. So I am grateful for all of you and your care for this community. So those are the questions I had ahead. We have 6 minutes. Who's got more? Linda. Okay, so I'm going to say that back so that folks can hear. So Linda's question was related to we're test driving the new shared values and covenant, and she's wondering why that might be better than the shorter principles that we have already. Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, that's why they're being test driven, right? We had sort of a commission worked for years on pulling all sorts of stuff together, talking to probably thousands of people, and Unitarian Universalists. And then they bring it to our assembly in June, and this past June, and we basically said, keep going. Like, it's not done yet, and keep going. So I imagine that as people use them over the next year, by the time we get to June of 2024, it may be that we change things a little bit. I have been messing with how they were originally written, not the language, but the format, to see if that helped with that challenge of it being kind of wordy. So in the way that it's written right now, there's a value, that's one word, and then there's a statement about that value that's usually a pretty short sentence, and then there's a covenant related to it. So there's sort of three, like the tiny, medium, and large for each thing. And I've been choosing just parts of them. Because for me, even though I get why they have put the covenant that goes with each value together, it's easier for me to internalize, to see all the values and then the covenant separately, kind of like how we have currently our principles, and then the sources are much wordier, right, that come after that. So that's just personal for me and to help with the flow of worship. I have no idea how it's gonna get handled down the road. And ultimately, we'll do what we're gonna do as a congregation. Because one of the things I wanted to make sure people remembered from when I talked about this earlier this month is, these are part of a bylaw document for guiding the work of an entire denomination, right? It's not necessarily what you're going to say in worship on Sunday morning. It's about trying to ground this big, huge, aircraft carrier of churches and people who have very different cultures and theologies in different parts of the country together. So I think it's very much still a work in progress. And one of the things that'll be interesting, and we're going to talk about this some next week, is there's lots of ways for every person to give feedback to that commission over the next year. So as we test drive stuff, if you think, I have this idea about how this could be better, you can submit that kind of stuff in, or we can do it together, So there's ways that we can help shape what it becomes as we go along. And I think a different way to answer your question about the length, I think they're just trying to, if you were to take the principles and sources as a whole, it's bigger than what this is now. They actually made it shorter, but it's just sort of framed differently, and they're trying to get all that stuff plus a little bit more into the same document. Yeah, Al. Yeah, okay, so Al's asking about how I manage my time and wait, say the last bit again. Relationship between the two jobs. Yeah, thank you. So, so for the first, when I first started here, I was working at Brandeis University, and then I worked for Amherst College for 12 years. And unless one of you happened to be an alum of one of those schools, probably my day job and this work didn't intersect very often. What's been really interesting now that I'm working at Berkshire Community College and am part of a program where some of you are also in that program, the Venn diagram of my worlds is very different. And in the beginning, it was a little bit, not bad in any way, but just like different. I had to get used to it. And now I'm finding all of these great opportunities for connection and opportunities to work together on programming, because both my day job, which is for a lifelong learning institute, and our congregation have some overlapping parts of our mission in terms of community programming and outreach. So there's some good opportunities there. I will say that working a job and a half feels different at 45 than it did at 30. But what you gonna do? It is what it is. I wanna do both things, so here I am. Any other questions in the room? Any on Zoom? And then I'm gonna get to you, Eric. You already had one in the thing, so. No, it's okay. Any on Zoom, Kenny? No? Okay, great. Eric, it's your turn.
I wondered if UUs are still considered cults by many denominations.
Are we still considered cults by our neighbors? Okay. I mean, I have no idea, but I think in different regions, there's probably different answers. I think in New England, because we were part of the Church of the Standing Order and tend to have fussy big buildings, probably not so much. But in other parts of the country where we might be in like former house churches or little storefronts or whatever, maybe it's easier to dismiss us. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do know that when we were looking at buying a building, there were some denominations from whom we could not buy their former spaces because of our theology. Not the UCC, we're good friends. All right, how are we doing on time? I could do one more quick one if anybody's got one. Or you can save them up for next year. Okay, well, I'll ask you a question that you can think about, not that you have to answer now. One of the things that I'm trying to figure out is, for the things that happen outside of worship, what's the right mix of stuff? And maybe there's different answers for different times of year, but lifelong religious education classes for grown-ups, social outings, all of that kind of stuff. We've been trying different things over the last year than, in this new post-COVID-ish world. And so feedback is helpful. So if there's things that you wish that we were doing totally differently or new, please tell me. I'm going to test drive a new class that I'm really excited about for the fall, which will be on second Sundays through the fall after worship, where I'm going to invite you to bring songs with you that help explain your personal theology, and then we'll walk through them together. It'll be kind of like a combination of like teenagers sitting around and talking about a song and grown-ups talking about theology. This is my hope. So, more to come, but, so I'm going to try stuff like that. I don't know, maybe it'll be a winner, maybe it won't. But if there's other things that we're going to keep hiking, that seems to be a good thing. But if there's other stuff that you wish that were in the mix, I'm always glad to know. That's your homework. Okay. Thank you for doing this with me today. Like I said, I'm always excited to hear what's on your minds.